In the shadow of war, when nations clashed and cities burned, it was not always the soldiers on the front lines who carried the weight of survival. In the countryside, far from the explosions and tanks, farmers, bakers, and families became the unseen hands that kept hope alive. Among them were those who risked everything, their land, their freedom, and their lives, to feed not just their own, but the fighters of the underground resistance. This is the story of one such hidden army, the farmers who fought back not with guns, but with food, courage, and silence. The year was 1942. Europe was deep in the grip of the Second World War. Germany's iron fist stretched across France, Poland, and much of the continent. The Nazis controlled transportation routes, confiscated crops, and demanded tribute from the occupied territories. The countryside, once a symbol of peace and abundance, became a battleground of scarcity and fear. Every sack of grain, every cow, every loaf of bread was counted and controlled by the occupying forces. Yet, hidden beneath this system of oppression, another network was forming, one that would feed not only bodies but also the fire of resistance. In a small French village nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, the people of St. Maurice had watched as German convoys rolled through their narrow streets. The occupying soldiers took over the town hall, posted guards at the mill, and set strict rationing laws. The people were left with barely enough to live on. But the villagers knew that the war would not be won in battles alone, it would also be won in the quiet defiance of everyday life. Marie Delacourt was a farmer's daughter, no more than 23 years old, with hands toughened by work and eyes that had seen too much too soon. Her family's land had been in their care for generations, fertile soil that had produced wheat, potatoes, and apples for as long as anyone could remember. But now, half their harvest went to feed the German soldiers stationed nearby. The rest was barely enough to keep her family alive. Still, Marie had a secret. Hidden under the floorboards of the old barn, she kept sacks of grain, tins of preserved meat, and bottles of milk that never appeared on the German ledgers. Those supplies were not for her family, they were for the resistance fighters who operated in the nearby forest. At night, when the moon was high and the German patrols had gone silent, Marie would hitch their old horse to the cart, loading it with baskets covered in hay. Beneath the hay, she hid food, bread baked in secret, vegetables pulled from hidden rows in the garden, and sometimes, when luck was kind, a small wheel of cheese. She would ride out into the woods, her heart pounding with every hoofbeat. There, among the trees, men in ragged uniforms waited, the Maquis, the French resistance fighters who harassed German convoys and sabotaged supply lines. They greeted her with whispered gratitude. She never stayed long. A quick exchange, a nod, and then she was gone again, back to her farm before dawn. She never asked their names. The less she knew, the safer they all were. Yet every delivery she made strengthened their resolve. Food, after all, was more than sustenance. It was hope. Across occupied Europe, similar acts of quiet defiance were unfolding. In Poland, farmers hid Jewish families in their barns while secretly passing potatoes and bread to resistance members. In Denmark, fishermen and farmers worked together to smuggle food, and people, across the sea to Sweden. In the Netherlands, entire villages banded together to resist German food seizures, burying crops in the fields and marking the spots only they knew. The war had turned the soil into both a weapon and a shield. One of the most dangerous parts of this underground network was transportation. The Germans controlled most of the roads, and checkpoints were everywhere. Farmers often used ingenious methods to disguise their deliveries. Milk cans carried secret compartments filled with weapons or letters. Sacks of flour hid small radios. Even livestock became part of the deception. Pigs and cows were sometimes moved along routes that also carried information. Every journey was a risk. Marie's brother, Luke, joined the resistance after witnessing the execution of a local boy caught stealing bread from a German storage truck. He became a courier, carrying messages between resistance cells. One evening, he returned home injured, a bullet wound to his leg. The Germans were searching for him. Marie and her mother hid him beneath a pile of hay in the barn, treating his wound in silence. For 2 weeks, German patrols came and went, sometimes even standing just feet from where Luke was hidden. Their mother prayed every night, her whispered words mingling with the creak of the old farmhouse walls. The war was unrelenting, and by the winter of 1943, the situation had grown desperate. The Germans had intensified their searches for resistance members. Villages were burned in retaliation for sabotage acts. Still, the people of St. Maurice refused to yield. Marie began working with a local priest, Father Benoit, who had turned his small church into a hub for resistance coordination. Beneath the altar, he hid radio equipment used to send coded messages to London. The messages often contained requests for supplies, not ammunition or weapons, but food. It was a cruel irony that in a land of farms, hunger was the constant enemy. German requisitions had stripped the countryside bare. To feed the resistance, farmers had to create what became known as ghost harvests. These were secret crops grown in remote or hidden areas, behind hedges, in forest clearings, or deep in valleys where German planes couldn't see from above. The crops were planted at night and harvested in silence. Entire families participated, knowing that discovery could mean death. Marie joined these efforts, spending long nights under the stars, her fingers numb from the cold as she planted rows of potatoes in secret soil. When the harvest came, she and others carried the food in small loads, distributing it through trusted hands. Each potato, each loaf of bread, was a victory. By early 1944, whispers of liberation began to spread. Allied forces were advancing. The resistance intensified its operations, guided by messages from Britain. Marie's farm became a crucial relay point for food distribution to nearby groups preparing for sabotage missions before the expected Allied invasion. The Germans, sensing unrest, grew more ruthless. One evening, they raided several homes in the village after receiving a tip about resistance activity. Marie's family was spared, for the moment, but the tension was unbearable. She knew they couldn't keep their secret forever. Still, when Father Benoit came to her one night, asking for help to feed a group of 20 fighters hiding in the woods, she didn't hesitate. She and her mother baked through the night, preparing loaves of bread, soup, and salted meat. Luke, though still limping, insisted on accompanying her to the forest. They set out before dawn, moving carefully through the mist. But as they reached the edge of the woods, they heard shouting. German soldiers had found the camp. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the trees. Luke pushed Marie to the ground, shouting for her to run. She crawled through the underbrush, her heart hammering. When the shooting stopped, the silence was deafening. She never saw Luke again. The Germans searched the area for days. Marie stayed hidden, surviving on scraps, afraid to return home. When she finally did, she found the farm ransacked. Her mother was gone, taken by the soldiers. The fields were trampled, the barn burned. Everything they had built, everything they had risked, was gone. Yet even in that moment of despair, she refused to break. The war ended less than a year later. The Allies liberated France, and the resistance fighters emerged from hiding. The people of St. Maurice slowly rebuilt their lives. Marie never saw her mother or brother again, but their names lived on in the whispers of the village, in the stories told by those who had survived because of the food she had carried. In the years that followed, historians would write about battles, generals, and strategy. But in small villages across Europe, people remembered the quiet heroes, the farmers who hid their crops, the bakers who slipped extra loaves into ration baskets, the women who rode through the night carrying bread for freedom fighters. They remembered the hidden harvest, a movement not of soldiers, but of souls who refused to surrender. Food, in those dark years, was not just about survival. It was a form of rebellion. Each secret harvest, each meal shared in hiding, was a declaration that humanity could not be starved into submission. The soil of Europe had seen blood and fire, but it had also nurtured courage. And from that courage grew hope, fragile, but unbreakable. Marie's story, though nearly lost to time, lives on in the records of local historians who found her name among the lists of wartime contributors to the resistance. In her later years, she returned to her family's land, rebuilt the farmhouse, and planted new fields. Each spring, she would kneel in the earth, remembering those who never came home. Decades later, when she was an old woman, a young journalist visited her to document the stories of resistance farmers. Sitting at her kitchen table, Marie spoke softly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes," she said. "We just did what needed to be done. Food was life, and life, even in war, had to go on." The journalist asked her if she had ever been afraid. Marie smiled faintly. Of course, she said. Every night, I thought it might be my last. But when I saw those men, hungry, tired, fighting for our freedom, how could I not feed them? Hunger is a terrible weapon. But kindness is stronger. The fields outside her window were lush again, green and peaceful. The war had ended long ago, but the memory of those hidden harvests endured, in every loaf of bread, in every meal shared among free people. For behind every victory in battle, there were those who fought in silence, armed with nothing but courage and compassion. In Poland, years after the war, a farmer named Jan would recall how his family risked everything to hide resistance members in their barn. They survived by growing crops in secret patches of land that the Germans never discovered. When asked why he took such a risk, he said, "A man who cannot share his food cannot call himself human." In Italy, women smuggled flour to mountain villages controlled by partisans, baking bread in stone ovens under the watch of enemy patrols. In Norway, fishermen disguised food shipments as bait, delivering them to fighters hiding in fjord caves. Each act of resistance, though small, was a lifeline. The hidden harvest was not confined to one nation or one people. It was a movement born of necessity and humanity, uniting farmers, peasants, and villagers across occupied lands. They tilled the soil under occupation, planting seeds of defiance. Their fields became battlegrounds of another kind, where life triumphed quietly over death. For the resistance, food meant strength. It allowed them to carry out sabotage missions, to survive in the mountains through harsh winters, to keep hope alive when everything seemed lost. But for the farmers, it meant something deeper. It was the last piece of freedom they could control. The Germans could take their livestock, their homes, even their children. But they could not take their will to feed, to nurture, to keep others alive. As the years passed, the stories of these silent heroes faded into the background of history. Monuments were built for generals and soldiers, but not for the farmers who hid bread under haystacks or the mothers who milked cows at midnight for men they didn't even know. Yet their contribution was no less vital. Without them, the resistance might have starved before it could fight. When Marie died in 1989, her farm was turned into a small memorial site. Visitors came to see the rebuilt barn, the old well, and the field that once hid the secret crops. A plaque near the entrance read, "Here, food was freedom. Here, the soil kept secrets." The hidden harvests of World War II remind us that wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by the strength of ordinary people who refuse to yield, by those who plant when it is safer to hide, who share when they have nothing, who feed hope in the darkest of times. Behind every act of defiance, there was a meal shared in silence, a loaf of bread passed from trembling hands, a life saved by courage. In every war, there are battles unseen, not fought on the front lines, but in kitchens, barns, and fields. The story of the hidden harvest is one of those battles, a testament to the quiet power of compassion, the resilience of communities, and the unbreakable spirit of those who believed that freedom was worth feeding. And so, long after the guns fell silent and the nations rebuilt, the memory of those who fed the resistance endures, in the whisper of the wind over the fields, in the breaking of bread at family tables, in the promise that even in the darkest night, humanity will always find a way to grow.